her hand, treating her like a wounded child or a victim herself. And obviously, he has to do that to give his client the best defense, but it looked almost like he was trying too hard to win the jury's sympathy. And that might have taken away a little bit. Other than that, he did a very good job. You could see him squirming when the medical director was on the stand. That was the one who was so positive toward the prosecution, describing how the children died. You could see his legs crossed. You could see him lean over. And he did the right thing for a defense attorney. That's what any good lawyer would do. You know you're not going to score any points for your side with this witness. Get him on the stand, get him off the stand. And that's what he did in his cross-examination. He didn't push in any way. Neither did he push in the grandmother, because the grandmother was sticking up for Lindsey, which is a very strong point for the defense, saying that even though she was Patrick's mother, she didn't think Lindsey ever meant any harm. She thought Lindsey was a good mother. And then when the prosecution tried to cross-examine her, saying, do you know that murder is a mortal sin, being there are probably Catholics on the jury in Boston, that seemed like a low blow to make toward a grandmother, a bereaved grandmother. And often people do that when they're feeling desperate, when they don't have any other cards to play. So they pull one out and they say, let's hope this works. I'll see where it lands.
And as you mentioned, yes, Kevin Reddington has been seen, consoling Lindsey several times throughout the trial, holding her hand during certain heartbreaking moments to her. Even one point, she cried out, "I can't do this." And he was seen, holding on to her, almost patting her back as her nurses rushed to her. He has reportedly been known to get close with his clients. Do you think this is maybe just one of those situations? I mean, he's been working with her for the last 3 years. Or do you think it's almost kind of like a show to the jury? Because obviously their eyes are on everybody in the courtroom, especially Lindsey and her attorney.
Yeah, it could be a character trait, but I think that it's more a technique in this case. Don't forget, she's sitting there. Not only is she sad, crying out, I can't do this, but she's in a wheelchair. When she jumped out that second floor window head first, they described how she messed up one of her cervical vertebrae and her lower back. She paralyzed herself for life. It wasn't temporary hurt. And now she's in a wheelchair. She obviously couldn't do the things she did, even if it weren't for the children. So he's setting up a picture where she's grieving for what she did to herself. She's grieving mostly for what she did to the children. She can't take it back. Maybe at the time, her postpartum psychosis was so great, she thought she was sending them to a better place. That was Andrea Yates' argument, whether it's true or not. But yeah, I think in this case, I think if it was a man who killed a strange woman, it wouldn't work this way so much. It works because she's female, she's paralyzed. It is children, which already engenders so much sympathy for the prosecution that he's got to use this card.
And you already mentioned this one moment from the prosecution where they questioned Lindsey's former mother-in-law on the stand, asking her, are you aware that murder is a mortal sin? And you kind of said this was almost like a desperation move for the prosecution. Could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Maybe I'm just projecting. In my mind, that would be the final card you pull out when you feel like, well, it's a Hail Mary. I'm going to lose anyway. My argument isn't that good. Anybody would expect his mother to, at the very minimum, be ambivalent about whether or not Lindsey was criminally responsible for what she did to the 3 grandchildren. And she was very much on Lindsey's side, saying not that she approved, of course, of that horrible action, but that she thought Lindsey had to have completely lost it, and that she never saw any indication that Lindsey was a bad mother. She saw only the opposite. And I think the prosecution was trying to break her argument in some way to get her to see how bad her daughter-in-law was. It looked like the prosecution was leading, which you're allowed to do when you're cross-examining somebody, but at the same time, she was leading her in a very bad direction. She tried by saying, "Did you sleep over their house? Did Lindsey ever invite you?" She invited her own mother, but she didn't invite you. Like trying to stir up jealousy, as if the mothers-in-law were two jealous teenagers. Again, that seemed to me to be a bit of desperation. I don't think the prosecutor expected this much support for Lindsey from the family members.
And just building on that, the prosecution almost tried to suggest that, Lindsey and her mother-in-law didn't have a great relationship and kind of questioned her about it, like, did you know of that? But then we saw when the mother-in-law left the stand, she looked towards the defense table and appeared to nod at Lindsey. Do you think that kind of hurt the prosecution's argument there in the cross-examination?
I think it did from the beginning to the end. The prosecutor was trying to get back some territory for the prosecution by saying, well, you didn't get along with her that well after all. Well, she seemed to favor her own mother, which isn't unusual that somebody will favor their own parent over an in-law. But the grandmother wasn't buying it. And I can't see that she gained anything by doing this. Some people might be motivated by something that they gain by taking the side, let's say Lindsey's family. She's the one they're going to be visiting either in the hospital or in jail. But the mother-in-law, she could have totally disowned her and said, I never would have approved of my son marrying her had I seen this side of her. And she didn't. She went out of her way to boost Lindsey's with the reputation, in a sense, at least her reputation before she did what she did.
And we've had 4 weeks of testimony and been shown dozens of pieces of evidence. Who do you think so far has made the best argument, the prosecution or the defense?
Honestly, at this point, I think it's the defense. I think the thing that put it over the edge was that the prosecution psychiatrist wasn't that skilled in dealing with postpartum psychosis. And also the very strong point that in this case, the burden is on the prosecution to prove she wasn't criminally insane, which is hard to prove. How do you prove somebody's not crazy? You can act sane 364 days out of the year, and on the 365th, you murder somebody. Does that mean you're sane or insane? So it's very hard to prove something that's as subjective as level of mental illness. Obviously, there's something wrong with Lindsey. She's had depression. She might even have mild psychosis, but was she able to distinguish right from wrong and the wrongfulness of her behavior? And was she able to conform her behavior to the standards of society? The prosecution has to prove one or both of those things. And it's hard to prove in retrospect, 3 years later, what was going on in Lindsey's head exactly when she committed the act.
I'm curious if there are any ways you think that this defense argument might fail, that, she wasn't really suffering from undiagnosed postpartum psychosis.
Is there a way that the defense's argument might fail? Sure, it might fail if they look at her prior history, if they look at the argument they're now trying to make, that she speaks perfectly normally now that she's away, now that she's in an institution. Other than that, she doesn't seem to show excessive remorse for her kids, but who knows? Maybe she doesn't realize that she did something horrible. She doesn't seem to show that much remorse that she's in a wheelchair either. She's never really, as it's been reported, spoken to anybody about how she feels about that day, if she could go back. Sometimes you always see a defendant crying, if I could go back, if I could switch places, I would, if I could go back and change it. Here it's her own kids in her own body, and she hasn't done that. So, yeah, I think they could say that they've certainly gotten people to say that she's sane. they're afraid if she went to an institute for the criminally insane, psychiatric treatment would help, and then she could be out there again, and who knows when she will do something similar, having another break. There's no predictor as to whether or not she would have another break. Even if she's sane now, it's very hard to prove she was sane or that she wasn't insane when she did it, except by her Googling the history on the computer and sending the husband out, planning all her events for the day, covering herself, you could say, by getting something from CVS for her child. You say, well, why would you do that if you know you're going to kill them? Well, that's a good cover story. Everything she did was a good cover story that a rational person would follow that type of path if they believed that if they were trying to set up a defense, although they would be more likely, I think, to say that somebody robbed a house or something, to set up a cover story other than that I did it, but I was crazy when I did it.